The scent of lemon polish and industrial cleaner clung to Elias, a familiar, inescapable shadow that followed him through the marble halls of the Sinclair Conservatory. It was a good smell, he often thought. The smell of quiet competence in a world that rarely noticed quiet competence. For 22 years, Elias Washington had been the silent guardian of this place. The man who buffed the floors where greatness was practiced. The man who dusted the display cases holding instruments worth more than his lifetime earnings. His hands, worn from scrubbing grout and replacing light bulbs, were large and scarred, and now they carefully maneuvered a vacuum cleaner through the grand foyer. Preparing for the annual Founders Gala, he had heard every note played in this building, from the tentative scales of beginners to the polished perfection of visiting masters. Yet he remained unseen, a ghost in brown overalls. A sharp, brittle sound sliced through the morning quiet, not music, but the distinct, sickening crack of fine, old wood hitting stone. Elias froze, his heart seizing in his chest. He knew that sound. It was the sound of something irreplaceable being broken. He switched off the vacuum, the sudden silence amplifying the frantic, hushed voices echoing from the rehearsal studio doors. He walked toward the sound, his heavy work boots suddenly feeling clumsy, intrusive. The door to studio was ajar. Inside, a scene of expensive chaos unfolded. Cecilia Sinclair, granddaughter of the Conservatory's founder and heir to the Sinclair fortune, stood rigid in the center of the room. Her face, usually a study in cool patrician beauty, was blotchy with shock and fury. At her feet, scattered across the ancient Persian rug, lay the pieces of a violin. Not just any violin. This was the legendary Duchessa, a Guarneri del Gesù, an instrument so rare it was housed in a climate-controlled vault when not in use. It was the crown jewel of the Sinclair collection, insured for $18 million. I don't know what happened. The voice belonged to Marcus Thorne, a handsome, highly touted violin student whose talent was matched only by his overwhelming entitlement. He was pale, sweating. It was the humidity. The strap must have slipped. It slipped. Cecilia's voice was low, lethal. She stepped over the fragmented instrument, her eyes fixed on the long, curved crack running down the back, near where the sound post would have been. Marcus, that strap was leather, custom-fitted and bolted to the case. You threw it, didn't you? You were angry about the concerto, weren't you? Marcus stumbled backwards. No. I swear, Miss Sinclair, I was just... Elias watched the exchange from the doorway, a silent witness. The weight of the moment was crushing. He saw the despair in the Guarneri's splintered body, the tragedy of a century of music, abruptly silenced. His eyes, however, were drawn to a specific detail. The precise way the scroll had separated from the neck. It wasn't a clean break. It was a complex fracture, demanding not glue, but deep, intimate knowledge of luthiery. Cecilia finally noticed Elias standing there, his vacuum cleaner abandoned 10 feet away. Her intense focus snapped, replaced by immediate, searing contempt. What are you doing here, Elias? She demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Get back to the foyer. This is a private matter, and for God's sake, put that thing away. It looks ridiculous. Elias instinctively stepped back, muttering, Ma'am, I heard a noise. I apologize. Apology accepted, now go. You'll track dust on the rug. She turned back to Marcus, her expensive silk dress brushing past the broken fragments on the floor. This is catastrophic, Marcus. The appraisal alone will be. She trailed off, staring at the pieces as if calculating the exact sum of her ruined future. Marcus, desperate, looked around the room, his eyes catching the light reflecting off the metallic parts of Elias's vacuum. His gaze fell on Elias's hands, resting loosely at his sides, those big, rough, janitor's hands. A cold, cynical idea formed on his face. Wait, Marcus said, his voice regaining a cruel confidence. He pointed a finger not at the violin, but at Elias. If it's broken wood. He's the maintenance guy, right? He fixes things. He uses glue. He knows the building's infrastructure. He glanced at Cecilia, a wicked glint in his eye. Why don't we ask him to fix it? Cecilia looked from the $18 million instrument to Elias, then back, a slow, condescending smile stretching her lips. It was the smile of someone who had just found a new, lower level of mockery. "Marcus, darling, that's not just broken wood, that's a Guarneri. It needs a luthier, not a handyman," she scoffed. She turned to Elias, her eyes raking over his overalls. The namatag pinned slightly crookedly to his chest. "Elias, do you even know what this instrument is? It costs more than your entire family will earn in 3 generations." The casual cruelty of her words was a punch to the gut. But Elias nodded, his face impassive. "Yes, ma'am. Guarneri del Gesù, Cremona. 1741. It has a distinctive soundpost patch near the treble side F hole." The silence in the room was instantaneous and heavy. Marcus looked stunned. Cecilia's haughty expression wavered just for a moment. You memorized the plaque information, did you?" She recovered quickly, her voice regaining its mocking edge. "Well, isn't that sweet? A true appreciation for the arts." Even from the cleaning staff, she picked up a loose, splintered piece of the violin's back, holding it between her thumb and forefinger like trash. "Since you're such a connoisseur, Elias," she purred, the sound dripping with malice, "why don't you fix it? Go on. Take your magic glue and your maintenance hands and make this whole unpleasant situation disappear." Then, the final, devastating flourish. She laughed, a high, sharp sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "And here's a challenge, Elias, a promise. If you manage to fix the Duchess, if you make it playable again, truly playable, by the night of the gala next week I will marry you." Marcus snorted with laughter. Cecilia's face was alight with malicious pleasure. It was a joke, a public humiliation, a way to underscore the absurd distance between them. She knew the repair was impossible for anyone but a specialized master luthier. She knew the very idea of marrying the janitor was the most ridiculous statement she could make. Elias, still standing in the doorway, felt every drop of contempt settle on his shoulders. He didn't blink. He looked not at the mockery in her eyes, but at the broken violin, and a strange, quiet resolve began to settle deep within his soul. "And if I do, ma'am?" Elias asked, his voice steady, low. The words hung in the air, transforming the joke into a contract. Cecilia laughed again, a sound devoid of warmth. "If you do, Janitor Washington, then the only thing broken will be my pride. But you won't, so run along and finish dusting the trash cans." Elias didn't respond. He simply walked into the room, past the stunned student, past the furious heiress, and gently, reverently, picked up the scattered pieces of the Duchessa. His rough hands, scarred from years of manual labor, held the delicate, broken wood as if it were spun glass. The light from the window caught his eye, and for the briefest instant, a flicker of something ancient, something majestic, seemed to ignite deep within his usually placid gaze. The sheer impossibility of the task settled over Elias as he carried the broken Duchessa into his tiny, windowless maintenance closet deep in the conservatory's basement. It was a space designed for cleaning supplies, spare hardware, and the oppressive silence of unimportance. Here, surrounded by industrial buckets and stacks of sandpaper, he laid the fragments of the legendary violin out on a workbench constructed from 2 mismatched filing cabinets. The damage was worse than he had initially assessed. The complex fracture at the neck, the separated scroll, the large, splintered crack on the back. This was the work of pure force, not accident. He traced the fissures with a calloused thumb, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't just a violin. This was a piece of history, an echo of the past, silenced by the careless ego of the present. And he had exactly 7 days until the Founders Gala. Cecilia Sinclair's mocking words replayed in his mind. "It costs more than your entire family will earn in 3 generations, and I will marry you." The threat of humiliation was now a profound motivator. It wasn't about the woman. It was about the principle. It was about proving that value was not determined by a price tag, a bloodline, or a job title. It was about the integrity of work, the sanctity of creation, and the dignity of a man who had been told he was nothing but a shadow. He knew that if he even touched the Duchessa with common wood glue or, God forbid, with any of the cleaning agents from the shelf beside him, the instrument would be irrevocably ruined. The repair demanded not a janitor's toolbox, but a luthier's laboratory. For the next 24 hours, Elias disappeared. He used his entire annual leave allowance, called in sick, and answered no phone calls. The Sinclair Conservatory assumed he was simply hiding from the consequences of his foolish acceptance. Probably embarrassed, maybe fired. Cecilia mentioned him exactly once over a lavish lunch, dismissing the episode as a laughably pathetic attempt at attention from the cleaning staff. But Elias was not hiding. He was working. He didn't need to leave the conservatory to gather his tools. His tools were already there, tucked away in an old, leather-bound box hidden beneath a false floor panel in the deepest corner of his closet. The box was stained with age and smelled faintly of aged pine and beeswax. Inside, nestled on velvet, lay the instruments of a forgotten master, tiny, precise chisels honed to razor sharpness, miniature planes crafted from African blackwood, calipers, clamps, and thin, smooth sticks of hide glue, some of which were older than Elias himself. He set up a microscopic light, its beam focused intensely on the broken parts. His large, rough hands, so clumsy with the vacuum, transformed. They became surgical, precise, moving with a fluid intelligence that spoke of decades of practice. He began by meticulously cleaning the fractured edges using a small, soft brush and a solution so delicate it looked like pure water. He worked in complete silence, the only sound the faint, controlled scrape of steel against ancient, sacred wood. He needed the specific wood for the soundpost patch, old Italian spruce, quarter sawn, aged for at least 80 years to match the density and resonance of the Guarneri. He couldn't buy it. He didn't need to. He knew exactly where the perfect piece lay. The broken back of an obscure 18th century German cello that had been deemed irreparable and stored in the conservatory's dusty archives decades ago. Later that night, moving like a thief in his own workplace, Elias slipped into the archives. He found the cello case, his flashlight beam illuminating the discarded instrument. With a single surgical cut using a specially curved knife, he harvested a tiny, perfect sliver of spruce less than a fingernail from the cello's discarded back. It was a trade-off, a small piece of one forgotten instrument to save a masterpiece. Back in the closet, the atmosphere was thick with concentration. He prepared the hide glue, heating it to the exact temperature in a small, battered metal pot. He knew the glue had to be applied quickly, then clamped with immense, calculated pressure. Too much, and the wood would crack further. Too little, and the bond would fail. This was not maintenance. This was an art form bordering on meditation. He spent for hours on the main back crack alone. Using custom-made clamps the size of peanuts, he slowly, infinitesimally brought the fractured pieces together. His entire being was focused on that line of fracture, willing the wood to forget it had ever been separated. When he was done, the crack was still visible, a thin scar across the dark grain, but the structural integrity was restored. It was a miracle of precision. The most challenging task was the soundpost, the small, critical dowel inside the instrument that transmits vibrations between the top and back plate, literally giving the violin its voice. It needed to be perfectly placed, perfectly tensioned, or the Duchessa would sound like a cheap, tinny toy. He carved a new sound post from the salvaged spruce, sanding it to a flawless finish with paper finer than silk. As he worked, a profound sense of peace enveloped him. He was no longer Elias the janitor. He was Elias the luthier, connecting himself to the line of Italian masters who had perfected this craft centuries ago. The dust and grime of the basement faded. The world outside, the wealth, the contempt, the looming gala ceased to exist. There was only the wood, the tools, and the weight of an $18 million trust resting in his own calloused hands. On the third day, the structural repair was complete. The Duchessa was whole again, but silent. It looked repaired, but the true test of a Guarneri was in its voice. Elias had one final task, one that required an act of reckless confidence. He had to string the violin. He had to play it. He reached back into the hidden leather box and retrieved a final object, an ornate, dark ebony bow, its horsehair aged and slightly yellowed, tucked safely beside a small, velvet-wrapped object. He unwrapped the velvet, a single, worn tuning key, its brass dulled by time and use. The moment he drew the bow across the newly strung Duchessa, the sound filled the tiny, cold closet. It wasn't the tentative squeak of an amateur. It was a deep, resonant D major, a sound so rich and melancholic it seemed to push the very walls of the maintenance room outward. Elias closed his eyes, his rough cheek resting lightly against the newly mended body of the Duchessa. His large hands, the janitor's hands, moved across the fingerboard, and in the oppressive silence of the conservatory basement, a sound arose that had not been heard in those halls for decades. It was the sound of true mastery, of forgotten genius emerging from the shadows. The janitor was playing, and the music complex, soulful, a perfect, aching interpretation of a Bach Chaconne was shattering. Elias re-emerged from the basement on the morning of the fourth day, no longer smelling of industrial cleaner, but faintly of pine resin and aged wood, scent that only a master luthier would recognize. He looked the same, still wearing the brown overalls, still moving with the quiet deference of the cleaning staff. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. He had held the soul of the Duchessa in his hands and given it back its voice. The instrument, now whole, lay safely tucked away in the deepest part of his locker, awaiting its terrifying debut. The atmosphere in the conservatory had changed. The hushed panic over the broken Guarneri had been replaced by a grim, tense silence. Cecilia Sinclair was now dealing with the fallout. The insurers had arrived, demanding to see the damage, their faces hardening as they learned the janitor had intervened. Elias was cornered by Marcus Thorne, the arrogant student near the staff break room. Marcus's face was slick with a mixture of fear and fury. "You idiot, Washington," Marcus hissed, leaning in close, his voice thick with privilege. "Where is the Duchessa? You didn't dare try to glue it back together with Elmer's, did you? Cecilia's mother is here, and she's ready to sue for negligence." Elias simply wiped down the stainless steel counter, his eyes calm. "The violin is in safe keeping, Mr. Thorne. I am preparing it. Are you going to buff it with floor wax? You need to understand, you are ruining the evidence of an $18 million crime. You are going to be arrested, you know that? Cecilia's family will bury you in paperwork." "Perhaps," Elias replied, setting a roll of paper towels down with deliberate precision. "But it will not be for damaging the violin. It will be for the original damage caused by carelessness." He met Marcus's eye, and the younger man flinched, recognizing the coded accusation. Marcus stumbled backwards, his bravado momentarily crumbling. "Stay away from me. Stay away from the Duchessa. If you have done anything to damage the acoustic integrity of that instrument, you will pay for it for the rest of your worthless life." The insult of the inspection. Later that afternoon, Elias was summoned to the director's office. The room was overcrowded with hostile figures. Cecilia, rigid with anger, her formidable mother, Eleanor Sinclair, radiating an aura of cold, dangerous wealth, and two tight-lipped insurance adjusters, Mr. Vance and Ms. Chen. Eleanor Sinclair did not look at Elias. She looked through him, addressing the director instead. "Tell me, Mr. Thompson, is it true that the cleaning man has been allowed to tamper with the most valuable instrument in our collection? Is this what my father's legacy has come to, allowing a maintenance worker to commit a felony?" The director, sweating profusely, wrung his hands. He took up the challenge. "Mrs. Sinclair, he promised to fix it by the gala. We had no choice but to let him proceed. The liability was already overwhelming." Cecilia finally turned to Elias, her eyes cold, narrowed slits. "Where is it, Elias? Bring the monstrosity you've created. Vance and Chen need to document the damage for the claim." Elias stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back, betraying nothing. "I cannot bring the instrument here, ma'am. The environment is too unstable, too many volatile emotions. I prefer to keep it in the secure climate of the storage room." His unexpected firmness stunned them. Eleanor Sinclair laughed a high, unnatural sound of disbelief. Secure climate? In the basement with the bleach and the mops. Are you quite mad? Janitor Washington? The temperature and humidity are consistently regulated, ma'am. Unlike this office, Elias's. Calm confidence was a new and unsettling layer to his character. The insurance adjusters exchanged a look. Mr. Vance, a man with the weary skepticism of a professional who had seen every flavor of fraud, spoke up. We need to see the instrument. Washington. Now, or we will be forced to file a report of willful destruction of evidence. Very well, Elias conceded. Follow me. The group, the Sinclairs, the director, and the two adjusters followed Elias down to the basement, their expensive shoes clicking on the concrete floor, a parade of wealth descending into the kingdom of the working class. They stopped outside his small maintenance closet. Elias opened the locker. He reached inside and slowly withdrew the Duchessa, still in its battered, protective case. The collective breath of the room seemed to catch. He laid the case on the workbench, the broken filing cabinet. He unlatched the velvet locks and lifted the legendary instrument. Cecilia gasped. Eleanor frowned. Vance and Chen immediately stepped closer, pulling out their professional-grade measuring instruments. The violin was whole. The scroll was firmly attached. The body was one piece. The crack is still visible, Cecilia declared instantly, pointing at the thin, dark line that traced the path of the original break on the backplate. Look at that amateur scar. You've ruined the resale value. The antique integrity is compromised. Elias held the violin perfectly still. The scar is permanent, Miss Sinclair. It is a record of its near death, but it is stable. Vance, the adjuster, leaned close, shining a concentrated light on the repair. He was looking for signs of common glue, excess residue, or the telltale warping of poor craftsmanship. He found none. The seam was astonishingly tight, the work meticulous. Acoustic integrity is the issue, Eleanor snapped. Aesthetically, it's a failure, but if it cannot sing, it is worthless. The sound post, Washington. Where is the sound post? Elias set the violin down and reached for a small, specialized till the sound post setter. He carefully adjusted the internal dowel, tensioning the top and back plates by the tiniest fraction. He then handed the instrument to Mr. Vance. You are an expert appraiser, sir. You know the Duchessa's voice. Play a scale. Test the F-holes. Vance looked uncomfortable. I assess value, not performance, but I can check the pitch stability. He took the violin gingerly, his movements hesitant. He pulled a bow from the case. The idea of an insurance adjuster testing an $18 million Guarneri was bizarre. Yet here they were. Vance drew the bow across the strings. The sound was thin, scratchy, and immediately off-key. Cecilia and Eleanor exchanged triumphant, relieved looks. See, Cecilia crowed. The sound is dead. The patch is interfering. You failed. Janitor, you just cost us millions? Eleanor stepped forward, her hand already reaching for the phone. Mr. Vance, document this failure. Washington, you are under arrest for destruction of property. The silent correction. Elias did not react. He simply took the Duchessa back from the adjuster, his demeanor utterly serene. Apologies, Mr. Vance, Elias said gently. You are used to modern instruments. You are not used to a temperamental Guarneri. The sound post needs to be placed by the hand that knows the instruments. Specific voice. He held the Duchessa close, smelling the wood, feeling its warmth against his chest. He then reached back into his worn leather box and withdrew the small, ancient, brass tuning key he had used in the night. He adjusted the pitch, not by listening to a tuner, but by the subtle vibrations he felt through his palm, a method centuries old. He placed the sound post setter back into the body, working blindly, relying solely on touch and muscle memory. The other luthiers he knew had nicknamed this delicate, internal adjustment the heart. Placement, the moment the heart of the instrument was returned to its proper place. When he was satisfied, he did not hand the violin back to the adjuster. He kept it there. Elias said, his voice dropping to a low, powerful register. Now, she is ready to sing. He raised the violin to his chin. The simple movement was transformative. The worn overalls, the rough hands, the institutional setting all faded away. The man holding the violin was no longer the janitor. He was a practitioner, a devotee. He lifted the ancient ebony, bow the same one he had used in the silent darkness of the closet. He didn't play a showpiece or a flashy scale. He played a single, sustained note, middle C. The tone that emerged was not thin or scratchy. It was glowing. It was a rich, deep, golden sound that filled the small, concrete room, vibrating through the industrial pipes and silencing the hostile voices. It was the distinct, unmistakable voice of a fully restored Guarneri del Gesù, sound that carried the weight of its 300-year history. It was pure, aching beauty. Eleanor Sinclair's mouth opened, but no words came out. Cecilia's face, a mask of contempt moments before, cracked. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of shock. Yes, but also tears of profound, instinctive musical recognition. Mr. Vance, the seasoned adjuster, dropped his notebook. He knew the sound of a genuine, perfectly functional Guarneri. He knew that this sound, this rich, complex voice was worth every cent of the $18 million appraisal. The janitor hadn't ruined the violin. He had resurrected it. Elias lowered the violin, the final resonance fading into the silence. He handed the Duchessa to the stunned adjuster. The acoustic integrity is sound, Mr. Vance, Elias stated, his voice quiet but commanding. The scar remains as a lesson, but the voice is restored. He looked directly at Cecilia, whose entire world, the ridicule, the confidence, the very basis of her identity had just been shattered by a single note played in a maintenance closet. The humiliation was total, but the truth was undeniable. I will present the Duchessa at the gala, Miss Sinclair. Elias finished. And then you will fulfill the terms of our agreement. The group retreated from the closet, leaving behind the janitor, the scent of wood, and the lingering, luminous sound of the repaired Duchessa. They left not in triumph, but in dread, the dread of facing the consequences of their casual cruelty and the mystery of the man they had mocked. The single, sustained note played in the basement hung in the air of the conservatory like a promise and a threat. Eleanor Sinclair, Cecilia's mother, was not a woman who accepted defeat, particularly not at the hands of someone she deemed a servant. Her initial shock quickly calcified into a cold, dangerous resolve. This is an insult, Eleanor declared later that evening, pacing the director's lavish office, her expensive pearls clicking against her silk dress. The sound may be restored, but the principle is destroyed. That man, that janitor, cannot be allowed to perform at the gala. It will be a spectacle, a mockery of the Sinclair name. Our guests are senators, ambassadors, and patrons of the arts, not participants in a social experiment involving the maintenance staff. Cecilia, unnervingly quiet since the basement encounter, sat staring out the window. Mother, the insurance adjusters are terrified. They confirmed the repair. If we stop him, he could ruin the reputation of the conservatory with a single call to the press. He could expose how the Duchessa was broken by Marcus, your favored talent. Marcus is irrelevant, Eleanor dismissed with a wave of her hand. The repair is the problem. It is too perfect. It is suspicious. No ordinary handyman could achieve that tone. He must be a fraud, a highly trained, disguised fraud. Eleanor's ruthless mind began to piece together a new, crueler strategy: control the narrative by controlling the performance. We cannot stop the performance, Eleanor decided, her voice regaining its cutting authority. That would confirm our guilt. But we can control what he plays and how he is introduced. She turned to the trembling director. Mr. Thompson, you will announce that Elias Washington is a last-minute replacement, a temporary substitute for the injured Marcus Thorne. You will not mention the marriage wager, and he will not be allowed to choose the music. We will choose it for him. Eleanor then pulled out her phone and made a series of rapid, low-voiced calls to her contacts in the city's music circles. She wasn't looking for a piece of music. She was looking for a weapon. She needed a composition so technically demanding, so emotionally complex, and so obscure that even a seasoned professional would struggle, thereby ensuring Elias's public failure. The challenge of the maestro. The next morning, Elias received his marching orders. delivered by the frightened director. Washington, the director stammered, avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Sinclair insists. The program has been finalized. For your performance, you are required to play the Chaconne from Bach's Partita No. 2 in D minor, followed by the Bartók Violin Concerto No. 2, Movement I. Elias paused in the act of polishing a brass railing. He recognized the trap immediately. The Bach Chaconne is widely regarded as the Everest of solo violin repertoire, a piece of agonizing, emotional depth that demands absolute technical command and musical maturity. The Bartók Concerto, on the other hand, is a monstrously difficult 20th century work, full of jagged intervals and rhythmic complexity that requires months of dedicated, high-level rehearsal with an entire orchestra. And the orchestra, sir? Elias asked calmly. The director flushed crimson. There is no orchestra. Mrs. Sinclair felt that rehearsing with the cleaning staff was inappropriate. You are to play both pieces solo. The demand was not merely difficult. It was a deliberate act of sabotage designed to expose Elias as a shallow imposter. No violinist, however skilled, performs a major concerto a cappella, without accompaniment, and then follows it with the most difficult solo piece in history, all without rehearsal. It was a setup for a catastrophic collapse. Elias, however, nodded. I understand the requirements, sir. Bach and Bartók, solo. He did not argue. He did not show fear. He merely accepted the impossible terms. This unnerved the director more than any protest would have. The broken legacy? As Elias prepared for the performance not by practicing, but by simply holding the duquesa and tuning it, repeatedly the narrative shifts to the origins of his secret skill. The leather box hidden in his closet contained more than just luthiery tools. It held the ghost of a magnificent failure. Elias Washington was not merely a janitor. He was the son of Elias Washington, a violinist who, decades ago, was hailed as a prodigy in the same halls of the Sinclair Conservatory. Elias possessed a rare, breathtaking talent, a sound that contemporaries described as having the richness of old cognac and the clarity of mountain air. He was a protege of the Conservatory's founder, but Elias Washington was black, and in the classical music world of the 1970s and 80s, the paths to the concert hall were rigidly defined by race and class. Elias faced incessant, subtle sabotage. Instruments were unavailable, scholarships were misplaced, and critics always found a reason to focus on his untamed technique, rather than his profound musicality. The crushing blow came at his final student recital. Elias was set to play the Chaconne, the very piece Eleanor had just assigned Elias but moments before the performance. His bow was sabotaged, the horsehair cut in a way that made a clean sound impossible. He collapsed emotionally on stage. Humiliated, broke, and betrayed, Elias left the world of classical music forever. He vowed that no Washington would ever subject themselves to the cruelty of that world again. He took up carpentry, then maintenance, any work that valued honest labor over fickle artistic judgment. But Elias never abandoned his instruments. He became an unparalleled luthier, healing broken wood, studying the science of sound, pouring all his frustrated genius into the craft of repair. He taught Elias everything, not just how to fix the wood, but how to listen to it, how to hear the resonance of the spirit within the instrument. He taught Elias Bach's Chaconne, teaching him how to play it on the rough wood of the workbench, treating every note as if it were a fragile piece of glass. When Elias died, he left Elias to things, the leather box of tools and a deeply ingrained sense of dignity in invisibility. Elias came to the conservatory not for music, but for the quiet, honest work his father had found peace in, determined to honor the vow of staying out of the spotlight. Now, Eleanor Sinclair, the very type of old-world prejudice that had destroyed his father, was forcing Elias to violate that vow and face the ghosts of the past she had unknowingly assigned Elias the very piece that marked his family's greatest tragedy. The final preparation. That night, Elias did not go to the basement. He went to the empty, echoing recital hall. He set the duquesa on the stage, the $18 million instrument resting on a simple wooden stool. He climbed into the upper balcony, overlooking the vast, silent hall. He took out his father's worn tuning key, and he began to play the only part of the piece that mattered to him, the Bartók Concerto. He wasn't practicing the notes. He was commanding the space. He played with a wild, untamed fury that Bartók himself would have recognized, a sound that was pure rebellion, a refusal to be contained by the cold precision of Eleanor's world. The notes flew across the empty seats, loud and chaotic, challenging the ghosts of the hall. He played the Bartók, the most difficult piece, first. He played it not for perfection, but for emotional release. He played it to drive out the poison of his father's memory. When he was done, the Duchessa was vibrating. The stage was silent, and Elias simply sat, breathing heavily in the darkness. He knew he couldn't play both pieces perfectly. He knew Eleanor's trap was designed to make him fail with the Bartók, thereby discrediting his inevitable success with the Chaconne. But Elias had a counter plan. He would not play Eleanor's game. He would not just defeat the challenge. He would utterly transcend the moment, turning the stage not into a venue of humiliation, but into a place of powerful, undeniable truth. The music would be his weapon, his voice, and his final, devastating answer to decades of institutionalized scorn. The gala was tomorrow night. The stage was set. The Founders Gala was a glittering, suffocating affair. Hundreds of the city's most influential patrons, critics, and socialites filled the conservatory's grand hall. The air was thick with the scent of lilac and old money. Cecilia Sinclair, draped in a gown that shimmered with the value of a small house, stood beside her mother, Eleanor, near the stage. They were coiled with anticipation, waiting for the moment the janitor would shatter under the spotlight. The room buzzed with whispers about the broken Duchessa and the absurd rumor of the wager. Eleanor had been busy, ensuring the true story was warped into a narrative of a janitor attempting insurance fraud using a priceless instrument. The director, his voice shaky, approached the microphone. He began the introduction exactly as Eleanor had scripted. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special performance tonight, due to an unfortunate incident involving the Duchessa and the sudden illness of our soloist, Marcus Thorne. We have a last-minute replacement, Mr. Elias Washington, one of our dedicated conservatory staff members." The applause was polite, thin, and immediately followed by audible murmurs of disbelief. Staff member, the janitor. Elias walked onto the stage. He was still wearing his brown overalls, which had been pressed and starched, but which stood out starkly against the tuxedoed orchestra, seats, and the backdrop of white marble. He carried the Duchessa, its golden brown wood gleaming under the spotlights. Cecilia looked at him with icy malice. He was fulfilling his end of the bargain, coming out to be publicly mocked, but she still felt a strange, unsettling dread. Elias reached the center of the stage. He did not bow. He simply stood, a man in humble work clothes, holding an $18 million secret. The director cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the room. Mr. Washington has selected the pieces that require immense courage to attempt solo. He will begin with the challenging, modern intricacies of the Bella Bartók Violin Concerto No. 2. A collective gasp went through the audience. Bartók, solo? That was insane. It was technically impossible. It was a joke. Eleanor Sinclair smiled a thin, vindictive smile. The trap was sprung. Elias lifted the Duchessa. He did not tune. He simply closed his eyes, took a single deep breath, and drew his bow. The Bartók, a symphony of scorn. The first notes of the Bartók Concerto were deliberately harsh, jagged, discordant, and loud. The piece, when played without an orchestra, sounded like a struggle, a battle between the violin and the void. Elias played the music of defiance. He played the chaotic, aggressive intervals of the first movement with a raw, untamed force, pouring all his father's past, humiliation, and his own pent-up anger into the strings. The music was loud, fast, and aggressively unpleasant to the ears of the refined audience. The room's reaction was exactly what Eleanor had planned. A famous critic in the front row frowned, leaning over to his companion, amateurish. "No sense of rhythm. This is a disgrace to the instrument." Cecilia smirked. "See, Mother, the technique is sloppy. It's too raw. It's the sound of a janitor playing. Marcus Thorne, seated smugly, whispered loud enough for the people around him to hear. He's just thrashing it. He'll crack the back again? Elias knew the piece was failing them, but he did not care. The Bartók was for his father. It was a scream against the institutional rules that had choked a genuine master. He finished the first movement with a final, violent chord that cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was heavy with judgment. But there was no applause, only the rustle of programs and the sound of suppressed laughter. Elias lowered the violin, his shoulders visibly heaving. He had completed the chaotic, impossible challenge. He had proven his courage, but he had failed to impress the elite. The Chaconne, the sound of truth. As Elias paused, Eleanor leaned over to Cecilia, her victory assured. Now, darling, the final humiliation. The Bartók proved his lack of taste. Now the Chaconne will prove his lack of soul. He is a failure. We win. Elias raised the Duchessa again. He held the bow differently this time, not with fury, but with reverence. He settled the body of the violin against his shoulder, resting his cheek lightly on the same wood. He had mended in the cold darkness of the basement. And then he began the Chaconne from Bach's Partie de No. 2. The music was simple, stately, and instantly devastating. It was not a performance. It was a conversation with the divine. The immense, soulful gravity of the notes poured out of the repaired Duchessa. Elias was no longer the janitor, nor the angry prodigy. He was the maestro. The tone was rich, thick, and profoundly ancient. It had the golden quality of the Guarneri del Gesù's best years, a sound that spoke of sorrow, beauty, and unwavering dignity. The single voice of the violin filled the enormous hall, becoming an entire symphony. The technical challenges, the double stops, the counterpoint, the massive emotional weight were not just met. They were effortless. The change in the room was immediate and absolute. The critic who had called him amateurish dropped his pen. His eyes widened, recognizing the unparalleled sound quality and the mastery of the performance. Cecilia, who had been ready to gloat, froze. Her breath hitched. The music bypassed her social defenses and struck her at the core that, despite her cruelty, understood true musical genius. The music was so pure, so honest, that it demanded respect. Eleanor Sinclair's triumphant smile dissolved. She recognized the Chaconne, but more importantly, she recognized the tone. It was not just the Duchessa's voice. It was a voice she hadn't heard in this hall in 40 years. As Elias navigated the heartbreaking emotional climax of the piece, the tears that had welled in Cecilia's eyes finally broke free, running tracks through her expensive makeup. She wasn't crying because he was good. She was crying because the performance was perfect. The moment of recognition. The music was so powerful that it forced Eleanor to confront the very memory she had suppressed for decades. She suddenly saw not the janitor, but the ghost of Elias Washington, the prodigy she and her associates had silently destroyed 40 years ago. The Chaconne had been his signature piece. The tone, the heartbreaking richness, was his tone, resurrected in his son's hands. A cold, dreadful realization washed over Eleanor. This was not a random maintenance worker. This was the son of the man they had chased out of the Conservatory. He knew the Duchessa because his father was the only one skilled enough to have repaired it in the past. He played the Chaconne because it was his birthright. She had designed the entire event to humiliate a simple man, but she had, instead, set the stage for a master to reveal the truth of her family's prejudice and cruelty. Eleanor's composure finally shattered. She whispered a single, terrified word, a word that would explain everything to the horrified patrons nearest her. ARAM ... The performance continued, moving into the final, agonizingly beautiful minor chords. The audience was mesmerized, held captive by a depth of music they hadn't heard in years. They weren't seeing a janitor. They were witnessing a miracle. As the final, solitary note faded into the silence, the applause was not polite. It was a torrential explosion of emotion, a standing ovation that erupted with the passion of an audience overwhelmed by genius. Elias slowly lowered the Duchessa. He did not acknowledge the applause. His eyes, calm and knowing, were fixed directly on Cecilia, who stood motionless, tears streaming down her face. The realization of her total humiliation complete. He had fixed the violin. Now, she owed him the marriage. And much, much more. The thunderous applause for Elias Washington was unprecedented in the history of the Founders Gala. It lasted for a full 2 minutes, demanding an encore that the janitor refused to give. Elias simply bowed, the Duchessa held carefully, and walked off the stage, leaving behind a crowd electrified by genius and utterly confused by the man in overalls. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Critics scrambled to retract their earlier notes, their pens flying to capture phrases like forgotten genius and the true voice of the Guarneri. The boardroom confrontation. Elias was immediately ushered into a side boardroom, a gilded cage where Eleanor Sinclair was already waiting, her formidable presence shaking with barely contained fury and fear. Cecilia stood beside her, pale and defeated, unable to look at Elias. The performance was acceptable, Washington, Eleanor began, attempting to claw back her control, her voice cold and professional, a rather unsophisticated choice of presentation, but acceptable. Now, let us discuss the financial settlement. Elias stood still, leaning against the massive mahogany table, the Duchessa resting securely in its open case beside him. He did not sit. There is no financial settlement, Mrs. Sinclair, Elias stated, his voice calm, tired, but unyielding. Nonsense, Eleanor snapped, slamming her hand on the table. I know who you are, or rather, whose son you are. We are offering you a clean slate, a substantial severance package, and full restitution for your father's past. A lifetime pension of $5 million, effective immediately, in exchange for your silence and your immediate resignation. She pushed a contract across the table, its pages filled with legalese, designed to buy Elias's complicity and protect the Sinclair name from the ghosts of Elias Washington. Elias glanced at the contract, a fortune he couldn't have dreamed of, and then looked directly at Eleanor, his gaze steady. Your offer is generous, Mrs. Sinclair, but I did not repair the Duchessa for money. I did it to fulfill the terms of a contract publicly made. The terms were clear, set by your granddaughter. Fix this broken violin and I'll marry you. The silence was crushing. Cecilia gasped, her head snapping up. Elias, that was a joke, she cried, her voice strained. A malicious, hateful joke. You cannot possibly mean to enforce it. Every word spoken on the sacred grounds of this conservatory carries weight. Miss Sinclair, Elias countered, his tone hardening. When you mocked my position, you made an agreement. I completed my end of the contract. Now, you must complete yours. Eleanor's face was a study in pure rage. You insolent swine. You dare to demand marriage to my daughter. Do you think this is some fairy tale where the scullion marries the princess? You will never be a part of this family. I have no desire to be a part of your family, Mrs. Sinclair, Elias said plainly. Your family destroyed my father's career and his life, forcing a master musician to abandon his art. I seek only the formal fulfillment of the agreement, the demand for restitution. And what exactly is that fulfillment, janitor? Eleanor sneered, regaining a desperate tactical edge. What do you want? Half the Sinclair fortune? The conservatory? Elias pushed the $5 million contract back across the table. I want no money, Mrs. Sinclair. I want justice, and I want the respect you have denied my family and every honest worker in this institution for decades. He turned to Cecilia, whose eyes were wide with apprehension. Miss Sinclair, I require you to legally marry me and divorce me immediately thereafter. The marriage will last exactly 24 hours. Eleanor scoffed. And what does this farce achieve? Elias laid out his true demands, the price of his penance, one by one, each condition hitting Eleanor and Cecilia like a physical blow. The public apology during our marriage. I require you, Mrs. Elias Washington, to host a press conference. You will publicly apologize to every member of the conservatories, maintenance and custodial staff by name, thanking them for their honest work, and admitting that their labor is the true foundation of this institution. The Marcus Thorne truth. You will also publicly confess that Marcus Thorne caused the damage to the Duchessa and was the instigator of the malicious wager, and you will ensure his immediate expulsion from the Conservatory, the Elias Washington endowment. The $5 million you offered me will not be a pension. It will be used to establish the Elias Washington Luthier Endowment, offering full scholarships to minority students with instrument repair skills, and funding a new, fully transparent audition process free of racial bias. The Duchessa's home, finally, the Duchessa will be removed from this building. It will be permanently loaned to the Southside Community Youth Orchestra, where it can inspire children whose talent, like my father's, is overlooked by institutions like this. The room was silent save for Eleanor's ragged breathing. Elias had taken their greatest asset, the family honor, the institutional reputation, the priceless violin, and demanded only moral, public restitution. He was not interested in becoming rich. He was interested in correcting a decades-old injustice. Cecilia looked at her mother, then at Elias. She saw the truth in his eyes. He was the only honorable man in the room. "Mother," Cecilia whispered, the tears returning. "He is right. We owe him this. We owe his father this." Eleanor's pride warred with cold financial panic. She knew that if Elias released the story of the broken Duchessa, the fraud, and the marriage wager to the press, the Sinclair Conservatory would be ruined instantly. The endowment was a small price to pay for survival. She looked at Elias, her eyes filled with hatred, yet also a flicker of awe. "You are more dangerous than any lawyer, Washington. You understand power." Elias picked up the Duchessa. "I understand what happens when power is used to crush dignity. That is why the conditions are non-negotiable." He set the final contract, the terms of the 24-hour marriage, and the immediate penance before Cecilia. "Sign it, Miss Sinclair." Elias commanded. "Fulfill your word, and the Duchessa will have truly restored more than just wood." The following afternoon, the press conference room at the Sinclair Conservatory was filled to capacity. News of the mysterious, flawless performance by the janitor, the broken Duchessa, and the bizarre marriage wager had leaked, turning the institution into a media circus. Television cameras from every major network lined the back wall. Elias Washington and Cecilia Sinclair entered the room, the flashes of the cameras blinding them. They were legally, if temporarily, husband and wife. The short, formal civil ceremony had taken place an hour earlier at the courthouse, witnessed only by Elias's elderly mentor and a stony-faced Eleanor Sinclair. Cecilia, wearing a modest, dark suit, took her place at the podium. Elias stood beside her, still in his pressed brown overalls, his demeanor calm, lending quiet dignity to the spectacle. Eleanor sat in the front row, rigid with suppressed venom, yet compliant. Cecilia began to speak, her voice clear but strained, reading from the document Elias had prepared, the official fulfillment of the non-monetary contract. "Yesterday," Cecilia began, "I made a public, hateful, and highly malicious wager with my husband, Elias Washington, a dedicated staff member of this conservatory. I mocked his humble position and challenged him to perform a repair that only a master luthier could achieve. He met that challenge, proving his genius and integrity." She paused, facing the relentless clicking of the cameras. "As part of our marriage agreement, I must now address the truth about this institution's history and its treatment of the people who truly support it. The confession and restitution." Cecilia's voice broke as she reached the part of the statement that required her to swallow her family's pride entirely. "First," she continued, her eyes finding the small group of custodial staff standing nervously in the corner, "I must offer a profound and unqualified apology to Mr. Thomas, Ms. Diaz, Mr. Jenkins, and every member of the maintenance and custodial team. I have treated you with contempt and disrespect. My family has operated this conservatory under the false pretense that our wealth created this art. This is untrue. Your diligent, unseen labor is the true foundation of this institution. I am deeply sorry." The staff members in the corner shuffled, some wiping tears. It was an unprecedented act of humility from a Sinclair. Next, Cecilia exposed the truth about the Duchessa's damage. The priceless Duchessa was damaged by the carelessness of a spoiled, entitled student, Marcus Thorne, not by accident. Mr. Thorne's actions and my subsequent attempt to blame Mr. Washington were an act of fraud and malicious intent. Mr. Thorne has been expelled, and the Conservatory will uphold the highest standards of integrity going forward. The press roared, realizing they were witnessing a complete social implosion. Finally, Cecilia announced the Elias Washington Luthier Endowment, reading the mission statement with genuine emotion. In honor of Elias Washington's father, the late Elias Washington, a genius whose career was unjustly stifled by the very prejudices this institution represents, we are dedicating $5 million to a new permanent fund. The endowment will provide full scholarships for minority students in music and luthiery, ensuring that talent, not background, determines access. The final divorce. With the public duties complete, Cecilia stepped back from the podium, her cheeks stained with tears of shame and, perhaps, liberation. Elias Washington stepped forward for the first and only time. He did not address the press. He addressed his temporary bride. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice carrying the authority of the man who had resurrected a Guarneri and demanded justice. "You have fulfilled the public terms of our agreement. Thank you for honoring your word. Our marriage is now concluded." He produced the divorce papers, which had been prepared and signed by him hours earlier, and handed them to Cecilia. It was the formal, final severing of the most bizarre and short-lived union in social history. Elias then looked past the cameras, his gaze sweeping over the opulent hall one last time. He gave a slight, satisfied nod toward Eleanor. The battle won not through money, but through moral force. The Duchessa's true home. The final act of the story took place not in the grand hall, but in a small, cramped rehearsal space on the south side of the city. Elias, now legally divorced, stood among a group of young, eager children holding second-hand violins. He wore a simple, dark jacket, no longer the janitor, no longer the husband, just a man of quiet substance. He had brought the Duchessa. He placed the $18 million, Guarneri del Gesù, on a velvet stand in front of the Southside Community Youth Orchestra. This instrument, Elias told the children, his voice gentle, was broken by carelessness and healed by love. It does not belong to the wealthy. It belongs to the music. It belongs to the voices that are often unheard. He then handed the Duchessa to a nervous, talented young black girl named Lena, whose own modest violin was held together with masking tape. Lena raised the Guarneri to her shoulder, its rich wood glowing against her skin. Elias gave her one instruction, the lesson his father had taught him. "Don't worry about the notes, Lena, just listen to the wood. Listen to the truth inside." Lena drew the bow. The Duchessa, free from the judgment and sterile wealth of the Conservatory, sang a note of pure, resonant joy. The sound filled the room, a promise of a new and biased future for music. Elias watched, his own hands finally relaxed, knowing that his family's legacy was not the tragedy of a lost career, but the justice of a reclaimed voice. He had fixed not just the broken violin, but the broken system that had tried to silence his father. The most valuable things in life, talent, integrity, and dignity, cannot be bought, sold, or insulted. True power is not the ability to command wealth, but the conviction to demand moral restitution. Never judge the worth of a person by the uniform they wear, for true mastery often waits in the quietest corners. If this story of justice and quiet mastery moved you, share this video. And next time you encounter someone in a service role, remember Elias Washington. Respect their quiet competence, for you never know the genius that lies beneath the surface. Subscribe for more stories where dignity always defeats arrogance.